A very accomplished and Ivy League trained American chemist named Karen Wetterhahn started experiencing tingling in her lower extremities. It was uncomfortable, but it wasn't enough discomfort to warrant going to a doctor. But shortly after this tingling began, Karen started noticing she was having balance issues. She would be walking down the hallway at the university where she worked when inexplicably she would just lose her balance and start stumbling and would either fall to the ground or would have to lean up against the wall to steady herself. Shortly after these balance issues presented themselves, Karen was hit with a host of other health issues. Her speech became awkwardly slow and slurred. She began hearing this white noise ringing in her ear that just wouldn't go away, and her field of vision drastically narrowed to the point where it was like she was looking through 2 toilet paper rolls. Karen's husband brought her to the hospital where she underwent this very lengthy and involved examination, which involved spinal taps and brain scans to try to figure out what was going on, because at first, none of the doctors had any idea. After the testing was complete, a doctor walked into the room with a clipboard, and he had this odd look on his face, like the news he was about to deliver he didn't really even understand. And so he consulted his clipboard one more time, looking at some paperwork, and then he looked up and he looked at Karen, and then he turned to Karen's husband, and he just says to him, "Sir, does your wife have any enemies?" It would turn out Karen was suffering from a severe case of mercury toxicity. And Karen had so much mercury in her body, in fact she had 80 times the toxic threshold, that doctors believed this had to have been an intentional poisoning, that someone must have attacked Karen trying to kill her with mercury. But Karen's husband said, I don't think my wife has any enemies. And then when Karen ultimately woke up, she reiterated that sentiment, that she did not have any enemies. The doctors, who knew Karen was a chemist, they asked her, have you had any recent exposure to mercury? And through slurred and difficult to understand speech, Karen would say that she had. In fact, over the last 6 months leading up to this hospital visit, Karen had had lots of exposure to mercury, because she was actually in charge of this huge $7 million research project that was looking to investigate the effects certain metals had on human health. But Karen assured the doctor that anytime she handled any of these metals, she was always very, very cautious, especially when she handled mercury, because she understood how hazardous it was. She said she always wore the proper protective equipment to make sure none of the substances made contact with her skin, and she worked under this big chemical hood, which is like a big vacuum, to ensure she didn't accidentally inhale any of the toxic fumes that came off of these metals. The doctor was totally stumped and went silent for a second, and then Karen at some point broke the silence by saying, well, there was one time I did have a spill with mercury, but it was totally meaningless, and I haven't thought about it until just now, only because we're trying to figure out what happened. She would go on to tell the doctor about an incident that occurred 5 months earlier. She had been working at her lab at the university where she was employed when she accidentally spilled 1 or 2 tiny droplets of mercury onto the top of her left hand near her thumb. Now, she was wearing all of the prescribed protective equipment, including latex gloves on her hand, and so when she saw these droplets on her hand, she wasn't concerned for her health. She just followed procedure. She stopped what she was doing, she wiped the droplets off, and then she left her workstation, she threw away the contaminated gloves, she thoroughly washed her hands, and then put new gloves on, and then just went back to work and didn't think much of it. The type of mercury that Karen had spilled on her hand was called dimethyl mercury. This is not the same thing as the shiny silver liquid we see in old thermometers. That is a hazardous substance, but it's nothing compared to dimethyl mercury. Dimethyl mercury is a clear liquid that is considered to be one of the most toxic substances on the planet. After hearing this story from Karen, the doctor agreed that overall this did seem like a kind of meaningless event, because she had followed all the proper procedures and those droplets had landed on her gloves, not on her skin. But since they had no other leads to operate on, he thought it would still be a good idea to test to see if dimethyl mercury could penetrate through latex. And sure enough, after they ran some studies, they found it could. In fact, the latex gloves that all these scientists were told to wear when handling this particular substance, they did nothing. The dimethyl mercury would penetrate through the latex in seconds. But even though they had just solved the mystery of how Karen got mercury toxicity in the first place, what no one could understand was why Karen was still suffering from the effects of mercury toxicity if her only exposure to it was 5 months earlier, just that at one time. Typically, people who have mercury toxicity, they will get better as soon as the source of their toxicity is removed. Meaning, when the mercury goes away, they get better. And it's because the mercury kind of pools in their bloodstream and their body will naturally excrete it and they'll get better. Unfortunately for Karen, it would turn out dimethylmercury is a little bit different. It's far more lipophilic than other types of mercury. Lipophilic means a chemical substance is more likely to bind and mix with fat tissue in the body. And since blood is primarily made of water, when dimethylmercury enters the body, it does not settle in the bloodstream. Instead, it settles in organs that are made up of primarily fat. And once dimethylmercury is in your organs, it takes an exponentially longer amount of time for your body to excrete it, if it ever does. And in Karen's case, when she showed up to the hospital, it was already too late. Some of the dimethylmercury had already made its way up to her brain, which is an organ made up of 60% fat, and there it began to destroy her central nervous system. 3 weeks after being admitted to the hospital, Karen fell into a coma, and then shortly after, one of Karen's friends was in the hospital visiting her, and she saw a tear was coming down Karen's face. And so the friend turned to the doctor and said, is she in pain? Is that why she's crying? And the doctor said, no, it doesn't appear her brain is able to register pain anymore. Karen would unfortunately never wake up from her coma. She would pass away on June 8th, 1997, roughly 10 months after those little droplets of dimethylmercury landed on her latex glove.